June 19, 1944, late morning over the Philippine Sea. American radar operators aboard USS Lexington picked up the first wave at 210 miles. No hesitation. Launched the Hellcats. Elevators rose. Engines roared. Within minutes, F-6F fighters were climbing fast, stacked in disciplined tiers, each pilot holding formation. No radio clutter. On the Japanese carriers far to the west, strike leaders believed they were approaching unguarded targets. Then their scopes lit with contacts closing hard. The first American salvo came head-on at high altitude. Precision burst fire. One formation broke, then another. The Japanese radio net dissolved into scattered calls. Bearings lost, fuel running down. Reports of entire attack groups failing to return reached Tokyo's Naval General Staff that evening. Not confusion, not misfortune, erasure. What the Japanese High Command did not fully grasp on the night of June 19, 1944, was that the engagement they had just witnessed was not an isolated exchange of aircraft, but the visible result of a structural shift in power, one built over 2 years of relentless American industrial expansion, doctrinal refinement, and carrier task force integration that had quietly reorganized the Pacific War at every level, from flight deck operations to fuel logistics. The Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, operated as a single coordinated combat organism, fast carriers screened by destroyers and cruisers in layered defense rings, each ring tied into a continuous radar network, each ship drilled to react to air threats with automatic execution rather than layered debate. American aircraft were not launched just to intercept. They were launched in overlapping combat patrol cycles, timed so that one division of Hellcats relieved another before fuel stress could compromise performance. The ships refueled at sea, their supply convoys guarded by long-range submarine screens. Every movement had margin, redundancy, and replacement built in. The Japanese fleet, under Vice Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa, did not. They were sailing from the direction of the Marianas with newly trained aircrews, many barely qualified for carrier operations, operating aircraft that lacked the self-sealing fuel tanks and survivability that American pilots had come to rely on. They carried less experienced maintenance crews and fewer replacement aircraft, and their carrier doctrine still assumed that coordinated strikes could be launched, assembled, and flown in large, decisive waves as they had at Pearl Harbor. But that doctrine required air superiority during approach, not radar-guided defenders intercepting them hundreds of miles from their targets. The American task force used the island of Saipan, recently invaded by U.S. Marines on June 15, as a strategic anchor. The Japanese command viewed the defense of Saipan not simply as a tactical necessity, but as a matter of national political survival. The island was one of the final shields protecting the homeland. Losing it meant exposing the Japanese mainland to long-range bomber attacks from B-29s. This pressure forced the Japanese fleet into decisive action despite the risks and despite intelligence gaps. Meanwhile, aboard the carriers USS Yorktown, USS Essex, and USS Lexington, American air officers reviewed intercepted transmissions and radar track patterns in real time, adjusting vectoring commands to airborne divisions before visual contact occurred. The American pilots were not operating blindly. They were receiving continuous updates: altitude, bearing, estimated fuel state of approaching formations. Radio discipline meant that these updates were short, coded, and instantly actionable. A Japanese strike group that deviated slightly from course did not vanish into the sea's expanse. It became a shifting track on plotting boards, followed by multiple interceptors positioned for altitude advantage. When Japanese aviators realized they were being engaged before their attack runs could form, they attempted to climb, to escape, or dive to break contact. But both maneuvers burned fuel rapidly, and the operational radius of their carriers had been calculated assuming a clean ingress and return, not prolonged evasive action. Reports reaching Tokyo after the first day of fighting detailed loss numbers that could not be replaced. Veteran pilots gone. Flight instructors gone. Entire carrier airwings diminished to fragments. The High Command did not simply see the loss of aircraft. They saw the collapse of the training pipeline behind them. They had built a fleet whose combat power depended on elite aviators, and elite aviators could not be mass-produced. The Americans, however, had constructed a training system that turned out pilots in numbers, with standardized gunnery training, standardized landing procedures, and an emphasis on coordinated formation fighting rather than individual dogfighting prowess. What the Japanese High Command observed was not just tactical defeat. It was a demonstration of a war machine that could generate, maintain, and reinforce combat power at a rate that negated attrition. Yet the Japanese fleet still remained at sea. Fuel reserves were limited, aircrews reduced, reconnaissance uncertain, but the strategic imperative to hold Saipan remained. Spruance faced a decision, whether to pursue and destroy the remaining Japanese carriers outright or hold defensive posture to secure the amphibious landings on Saipan. His choice in the next hours would determine the direction of the entire Pacific campaign. Spruance held the fleet on its defensive perimeter for several hours after the first day's fighting. keeping the carriers positioned east of Saipan to ensure uninterrupted air cover for the Marine beat. The pressure was tangible across every combat information center, radar operators watching long-range sweeps for any sign of regrouping. Japanese aircraft, signal intelligence teams combing intercepted transmissions for shifts in enemy carrier headings, and deck crews keeping fighter groups cycled for rapid relaunch. Yet the reports returning to Spruance from his air commanders, especially Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher of Task Force 58, were clear. The Japanese carriers had suffered overwhelming losses and were now vulnerable. Their remaining strike capacity was fragmented. Their pilots were exhausted, but they were not yet destroyed. If allowed to withdraw intact, they would remain a threat to continued amphibious operations in the Marianas. Mitcher pressed for permission to pursue west, to close distance, to finish the Japanese carrier force while it was disorganized. Spruance, aware that pushing too far reduced the protective buffer for the Marines on Saipan, weighed the choice in silence, while officers on the flag bridge plotted ranged circles of land-based Japanese bombers from Guam, Tinian, and Rota. Every mile west carried new risk. Reconnaissance reports suggested that Admiral Ozawa's fleet was retreating in scattered formation, partially due to fuel constraints. Japanese tanker availability was limited, and several oilers had been forced to withdraw under submarine threat. The Japanese carriers now operated closer to their minimum fuel threshold for aircraft recovery, which meant any further combat engagement would strain their ability to bring back surviving pilots. Yet Ozawa's staff believed the Americans would remain fixed in a defensive posture around Saipan, protecting their amphibious operations. If the Americans stayed static, the Japanese could reposition overnight and strike again at dawn. This assumption fed into their overnight planning, where they attempted to consolidate their remaining aircraft on carriers with intact flight decks. Despite overloaded hangar spaces and maintenance crews working without rest or spare parts, aboard the USS Lexington, flight deck crews continued night operations under red lighting, preparing strike aircraft for launch at first light if ordered. Pilots slept in short intervals, flight jackets folded under their heads, boots still on. Briefing rooms stayed active through the night, where air officers recalculated approach vectors, fuel reserves, and likely interception altitudes. The Marines on Saipan, still fighting for control of airfields, understood that whether or not land-based Japanese aircraft would reinforce the next day depended entirely on whether the carriers offshore could maintain uninterrupted fighter screening. The entire invasion relied on control of the air. Every ship captain and operations officer across the fleet knew that maintaining initiative required not only tactical success but the willingness to push for finality while the advantage remained. The debate over pursuit versus defense was not abstract. It was immediate, and every passing hour threatened to shift the operational balance. By dawn on June 20th, radar screens indicated no new Japanese airstrikes. But the absence of attack did not reduce the tension. Instead, it suggested repositioning. Mitcher argued that inaction now granted Ozawa time to recover, reorganize, and potentially re-engage with more deliberate strike coordination. Spruance, now weighing updated intelligence, authorized Task Force 58 to move west. Cautiously at first, extending reconnaissance beyond standard operational radius. Cruiser-based search planes launched at dawn, spreading in fanned arcs, each equipped with limited fuel and only basic defensive armament. Their survival depended on remaining unseen. Hours passed with intermittent reports of scattered Japanese ship contacts, none initially confirmed as carriers. Mitcher ordered additional search flights from Yorktown and Hornet, knowing each search aircraft risked not returning. It was calculated, pressure, trade reconnaissance airframes and fuel to secure the decisive information needed to strike. Mid-afternoon, one of the scout planes reported visual confirmation. Japanese carriers located roughly 275 miles west of Task Force 58's position. The range report was significant. Standard strike distance for American carrier aircraft was between 200 and 250 miles under ideal conditions, allowing time for attack and return without fuel, starvation. At 275 miles, the strike would push pilots to the limits of endurance and aircraft to the edge of usable fuel capacity. If the Americans launched now, they could potentially destroy the remnants of the Japanese carrier fleet, but the aircraft might not return before nightfall. Night carrier landings were notoriously dangerous. Many American pilots had never attempted them. Losses could be severe even without enemy fire. The decision required acceptance of operational risk against a decisive strategic reward. Mitcher understood the stakes. Destroying the Japanese carrier force here would remove the last offensive arm of the Imperial Navy. The Pacific War's strategic momentum would shift permanently. He sent the recommendation to Spruance: launch a late-day strike despite range and recovery risks. Spruance approved. Communications teams moved instantly. Flight decks became controlled chaos. Engines warming, ordnance crews attaching bombs and torpedoes, armorers checking gun belts, aviation mechanics verifying fuel lines. Pilots received rapid briefings, altitude approach, attack group sequencing, rally points for return navigation at dusk. There was no extended rehearsal. There was only execution. The strike group assembled in the air in staggered layers, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and Hellcats for escort. The formation moved west, maintaining radio silence. Pilots tracked fuel consumption closely, adjusting throttle and trim to preserve every gallon. The horizon ahead was clear, empty ocean. The position of the Japanese fleet remained fixed in their minds only as grid coordinates and bearing estimates. They flew toward a target that might already be moving. Aboard Japanese carriers, lookouts scanned the sky continuously, knowing that any incoming attack would likely be their final test of cohesion. Fuel shortages restricted their ability to launch large air responses. They could still launch fighters to defend, but their pilots lacked rest and replacement numbers were minimal. Their command staff had anticipated American pursuit, but not so soon, not at this distance, not with such confidence. As the American strike group approached attack range, the pilots could not yet see the enemy fleet. The sun was beginning to dip. Fuel would soon dictate the point of no return. The lead pilots checked their watches, calculating the diminishing margin for the flight back. The horizon broke. Smoke trails, ship wakes. The Japanese carriers were there. The Americans remained undetected for the moment. No more adjustments, no reconsideration. This was the moment where the next order would decide the battle, and the first radio call would begin the engagement. The lead pilot keyed his mic only long enough to send the strike code, a flat, controlled transmission that snapped every aircraft into the final attack sequence. Hellcats peeled outward and upward to screen against any last-minute Japanese interceptors. But only a thin cluster of defending Zeros rose to meet them, their formations loose, closure angles misjudged. Many pilots too fatigued to hold tight maneuver discipline. The Americans cut through quickly. Short bursts, no chasing kills, simply clearing the corridor for the bombers. Below, the Japanese fleet began evasive movement, carriers turning into the wind for possible launch, destroyers tearing white wakes as they maneuvered to throw off torpedo aim, anti-air batteries rising to full rate of fire. The American dive bombers shifted into their attack stacks, altitude bleeding away in controlled steps as they identified targets by deck markings and carrier silhouette. Torpedo planes descended to sea level, throttles eased back, propellers biting into humid air, holding a straight run that exposed them to every gun on every ship in the formation. But the coordination held. Each pilot trusted the man on his wing, trusted the briefing, trusted that timing and angles mattered more than individual survival decisions. The first anti-aircraft bursts found their spacing. Black puffs at altitude chased the dive bombers. Bright, continuous tracer streams tracked the torpedo runs. A bomber in the 2nd Attack Division took a direct hit to the wing route and dropped out, the pilot steering it away from the formation with no radio call, no hesitation, only the practiced instinct to avoid breaking attack flow. The torpedo group leader kept eyes forward, not on the falling aircraft, calling slight course correction to maintain alignment with the Japanese carrier's predicted turn. Every second was calculation under fire. Too soon, and the torpedo would run wide. Too late, and the carrier would outrun its impact run. Above them, the dive bombers inverted and began their steep descent. Wind noise drowned out nearly everything inside the cockpit. Bomb crutches swung open. The pilot's entire world reduced to a carrier deck framed between crosshairs and altimeter. On the Japanese flagship, flight deck crews scrambled to clear aircraft staged for launch, pushing some to the deck edges and securing others in hangars where fires were already a risk. The Japanese gunnery officers attempted controlled fire patterns, but ammunition crews were short-handed and fatigued, elevating reload times and forcing guns to cycle unevenly. Several mounts overheated. Still, the volume of fire was lethal at close distance. One torpedo plane's engine seized just before release range. The pilot held course anyway, releasing at extreme distance before the aircraft skipped across the waves. The torpedo ran truer than expected. The pilot's final act created one more threat the Japanese now had to maneuver against. Meanwhile, the dive bombers reached their commit point. They released in staggered timing, bombs free, fins stable, each trailing smoke marker to confirm impact trajectory to following aircraft. The Japanese carrier captains executed emergency hard turns, trying to comb torpedo tracks while throwing off dive bombing aim. This maneuvering forced their own escorts to adjust formation quickly, creating blind arcs and anti-air defense and openings the American pilots exploited. A bomb struck the forward flight deck of one carrier, the explosion visible instantly to every aircraft in the strike group. The flame bloom marked the beginning of the engagement's momentum shift. The Japanese attempted counterattack launches, but the few fighters that made it into the air had no altitude or speed advantage, and the Hellcats intercepted them almost immediately. Each second that passed tightened the noose around the Japanese fleet, but the Americans were not insulated from loss. Several torpedo aircraft failed to clear blast radius after release and were caught in intersecting anti-air arcs. Dive bombers pulling out of their dives found themselves flying directly across cruiser batteries set to automatic sweep patterns. The radio net remained mostly silent, broken only by short-range calls. hit, turning, fuel check. The return journey's ever-present threat pressed on every pilot's awareness. They had only minutes before they would have to break off, regardless of how much damage had been inflicted. The Japanese high command aboard the surviving carriers saw the situation deteriorating in real time. The radar plots showed gaps where air defense coverage should have been continuous. The flight control officers realized that even if they could launch additional fighters, deck damage and fuel line ruptures would prevent full recovery cycles. The fleet had passed the threshold where individual acts of courage could alter outcome. The system was breaking. Coordination, not bravery, was failing. And once that collapsed, no amount of skill could restore combat capability at sea. Still, resistance continued. Destroyers closed in to lay smokescreens, attempting to obscure carrier silhouettes. This forced American pilots to rely on earlier target identification in estimated ship headings. Those calculations now mattered more than visibility. One squadron leader corrected his entire Group's flight path based only on wake angles, visible through thinning smoke, trusting the logic rather than the eye. The correction brought them directly into position over the damaged carrier. The remaining anti-aircraft guns concentrated upward, knowing the next strike would decide whether flight operations could continue at all. Below, the torpedoes reached running depth, closing silently, their wakes almost invisible now in the ship churn. The Japanese carrier began a final evasive turn, engines straining, rudder at full angle. The Americans watched from altitude, holding formation. They did not know yet if the angle was enough. They would know in seconds. And that was the moment everything converged. The torpedo struck just aft of the carrier's island, the impact not a single explosion but a deep heavy shock that vibrated up through the hull and into the air, a physical concussion that every pilot watching from above registered even at altitude. Flames rolled along the flight deck, lifting debris, and the carrier's turn slowed as if the ocean had seized it by the keel. The dive bomber leader kept his formation steady, holding altitude to confirm secondary fires before ordering withdrawal. Below, the carrier's deck crews tried to smother the fire lines with foam. But ruptured fuel lines fed fresh ignition, and the firefighting teams were forced back by heat they could not overcome. The Japanese command staff stood in the navigation bridge, watching the deck buckle and black smoke push upward in dense choking columns. They understood instantly that flight operations on that carrier were finished, and with them any ability to reconstitute a coordinated air defense. One ship could be a loss, but this loss represented the internal structural break they had feared, the point at which they could no longer project or rebuild striking power. In the sky, the American pilots turned for home. Throttles eased back to conserve fuel. Formation tight to maintain navigation alignment across the featureless expanse of ocean. The sun was dropping fast, and the horizon no longer offered clear visual orientation. Each pilot checked fuel gauges that hovered precariously near minimum reserve. The tension was silent, a held breath across dozens of cockpits. The order to launch had accepted the probability of night return. Now, that probability became unavoidably real. Over the radios, voices remained clipped and minimal, bearing updates, altitude reminders, occasional recalculations for drift compensation. The pilots flew not just against distance but against time. Behind them, the Japanese fleet attempted to lay smoke and screen the damaged carrier, but the rising fire made concealment impossible. The crew on board now fought only to prevent magazine detonation. Officers moved men into damage control lines, even as sections of the deck warped beneath their boots. Aboard another Japanese carrier still intact, the flight operations officer reviewed available aircraft. He counted them by hand, not assumption. How many could launch? How many had pilots capable of night operations? How many had fuel enough for more than one pass? The numbers were insufficient. The fleet could no longer attack, it could no longer defend. Effectively, it could only run. And retreat meant conceding the sea and the strategic objective protecting the homeland. The realization moved through the bridge wordlessly. No one voiced it. No one needed to. The American formation reached the halfway mark. Light was fading. The sea below turned black. Horizon lines dissolved. The pilots now flew by instrument and trust. The danger was no longer enemy fire, but disorientation and fuel starvation. Mitchell aboard Task Force 58 received updates on estimated recovery times. He understood that without visual reference, the carrier decks would be nearly impossible to find. He made the call that defined the moment. Turn on the lights. It violated every rule of carrier warfare. It risked exposing the fleet to possible night submarine attack. But leaving his pilots without a beacon meant certain loss. All carriers and escorts lit their running lights, deck lights, and search beams, turning the formation into a visible constellation on the ocean. Pilots saw the glow before they saw the ships, a fragile promise of survival in the blackout void. The Japanese lookouts also saw it. They understood instantly what it meant. The American fleet was willing to risk its own protection to save every returning aviator. That decision carried weight beyond battle doctrine. It spoke to an operational confidence the Japanese command no longer possessed. Their fleet could not risk anything for their pilots because they could not replace what they still had. The Americans could. The first wave of returning aircraft reached the carriers. Recoveries were fast, almost frantic, engines cutting to idle as wheels touched deck, hooks catching arrestor cables with hard, jarring impact. Several aircraft came in low or off angle. Deck crews were ready. Fire suppression teams pre-positioned. A few planes ditched into the sea when fuel ran dry moments before landing. Rescue destroyers moved at full speed, nets and lines ready. Every saved pilot meant the next mission remained possible. Meanwhile, the Japanese carrier that had taken the torpedo continued to burn. Damage control parties attempted to flood the magazines, but the heat had become too severe. Compartments warped, bulkheads collapsed inward. The captain issued the order to abandon ship. The crew began evacuation quietly, with the discipline that had carried them through years of war. The command staff remained on the bridge until the angle of the deck forced them to move. As they exited, they passed the rising column of smoke that now marked the ship's fate. From the air, the American pilots who had already landed saw nothing of this. They sat in briefing rooms, sweat drying cold on their collars, flight gloves still on. They stared at the deck or at nothing, replaying runs, adjusting calculations, waiting for casualty lists. And on the Japanese flagship, the senior officers recorded the final assessment. They had lost more than ships. They had lost the initiative. The war's trajectory had shifted here. In this battle, in this hour, the sea quieted, engines settled, fires dimmed. The moment of realization settled like weight across both fleets. The outcome was not yet announced, but everyone who had seen what happened knew what it meant. A spoke soft to no one, recounting final radio words under their breath because saying them aloud made them feel less like ghosts. Yet amid the grief and exhaustion, there was also a sense of something like clarity. They understood the scale now, not just of the battle, but of what remained. The war had not ended. It had turned. The next morning arrived with no ceremony, just the steady hum of engines and a faint line of light over the water. And the men rose into it knowing that survival did not mean closure, only continuation. The cost would travel with them, quiet, persistent, shaping how they walked, how they spoke, how they remembered. And still, they prepared for the next call. If this journey moved you, sit with it for a moment. The weight of survival, the cost of decisions. The silence after the smoke clears. These stories matter because they were lived, not imagined. And remembering them changes how we understand power, sacrifice, and responsibility. If you want more stories told with this level of care, insight, and respect, let us know. Leave a comment with what struck you most. Share this so others can feel the shift in perspective these men endured. Subscribe if you want to follow where history turns next. Not just dates and names, but the human pulse inside every decision. Your engagement keeps these memories alive, keeps them examined, keeps them real. The past speaks. We choose whether to listen.